In early December 1941, Leningrad was dying. German forces had besieged city since September. Over 2 million civilians and defenders were trapped with supplies running desperately low. Starvation had already begun. Ration cards were cut repeatedly. People ate wallpaper paste, leather belts, sawdust mixed into bread. Deaths from hunger were increasing daily. However, there remained one slender lifeline: railroad through town of Tikhvin, 100 miles east of Leningrad. This railroad carried what little supplies could reach besieged city. On November 8, 1941, German forces captured Tikhvin, cutting that last railroad connection. Leningrad's situation became catastrophic. Within days, Soviet High Command ordered immediate counter-offensive to recapture Tikhvin, regardless of cost. Failure would mean Leningrad's fall and death of over 1 million civilians trapped in besieged city. This was Battle of Tikhvin, and it would prove to be one of most critical forgotten battles of entire war. Tikhvin was a small town of approximately 30,000 inhabitants located on Tikhvin River in northwest Russia, between Leningrad and Volkhov River. Town's significance was entirely due to railroad junction. Railroad line from Moscow ran north through Tikhvin, then west toward Leningrad. This was only railroad connection, not cut by German siege lines around Leningrad. Supplies shipped by rail to Tikhvin could then be transported by truck to Volkhov River, loaded onto barges moved across Lake Ladoga, and finally trucked into Leningrad. Route was circuitous and inadequate for city's needs, but it was all that existed. Loss of Tikhvin would eliminate even this tenuous supply line, leaving Leningrad completely isolated. German offensive toward Tikhvin began October 16, 1941, as part of larger Operation Typhoon aimed at capturing Moscow. German Army Group North assigned 39th Motorized Corps task of capturing Tikhvin to complete encirclement of Leningrad. Corps consisted of 12th Panzer Division, 18th Motorized Infantry Division, and 20th Motorized Infantry Division. These were veteran formations that had fought since June 22 Operation Barbarossa opening. However, by October, they were exhausted. Months of continuous combat had reduced strength significantly. Panzer Division had only 60 operational tanks compared to over 200 at campaign start. Infantry divisions were at 60% strength. Casualties, replacements, and mechanical breakdowns had taken severe toll. Soviet forces defending Tikhvin area were equally depleted. Fourth Army, responsible for sector, had been battered in retreat from initial German invasion. Units were under strength, disorganized, and demoralized. However, Soviet High Command recognized Tikhvin's critical importance and began rushing reinforcements. Fresh divisions from Siberia and Far East were diverted to Tikhvin sector. These troops were better equipped and trained than units that had been fighting since June. More importantly, they included soldiers experienced in winter conditions, which would soon become a decisive factor. German advance on Tikhvin proceeded through difficult terrain. Region between Volkhov River and Tikhvin was heavily forested with numerous rivers, streams, and marshlands. Roads were primitive dirt tracks that turned to mud in autumn rains. Wheeled vehicles often became stuck. Even tracked vehicles struggled in conditions. Despite obstacles, Germans pushed forward. Soviet resistance was determined but uncoordinated. Individual units fought hard but lacked overall direction. By early November, German spearheads were approaching Tikhvin from south and east, threatening to encircle defending forces. November 8, 1941, German forces entered Tikhvin after 3 weeks of fighting. Soviet Fourth Army defenders withdrew northward to avoid encirclement. German commanders celebrated capture a significant victory. They had severed Leningrad's last railroad connection. More importantly, they had advanced to within 100 miles of Svir River, which would complete strategic encirclement of Leningrad and allow junction with Finnish forces operating from north. However, celebration was premature. German forces were overextended. Supply lines stretched back over 150 miles through primitive roads already turning to ice and snow. Frontline units were exhausted, casualties, heavy equipment depleted. Winter was arriving with freezing temperatures and heavy snow. German soldiers had only summer uniforms. No winter clothing had been issued because German planners assumed Soviet Union would be defeated before winter. Soviet response to Tikhvin's fall was immediate and desperate. Stalin personally ordered General Kirill Meretskov to take command of Fourth Army with explicit orders to recapture Tikhvin at any cost. Meretskov was an experienced commander who had led successful operations in winter war against Finland. He understood winter warfare and knew how to utilize harsh conditions as weapon against unprepared enemy. Meretskov immediately began planning counter-offensive. He assembled forces from multiple sources. Fresh divisions from Siberia were arriving daily. Local garrison troops were mobilized. Even partially trained militia units were pressed into service. By early December, Meretskov had assembled approximately 100,000 troops for offensive, though many were inadequately trained and equipped. Weather became a crucial factor. November turned bitterly cold. Temperatures plunged to -20 degrees Celsius, then -30. Heavy snow fell, blanketing landscape. Roads became impassable to wheeled traffic. Rivers and lakes began freezing solid. Marshes that had been obstacles in autumn became solid ground once frozen. German forces suffered catastrophically from cold. Summer uniforms provided no protection. Soldiers stuffed newspapers inside uniforms for insulation. Frostbite became epidemic. Vehicle engines froze solid despite efforts to keep them running continuously. Oil congealed, weapons jammed, horses died from exposure and lack of fodder. German combat effectiveness declined dramatically as soldiers focused on basic survival rather than military operations. Soviet forces suffered from cold as well, but were better prepared. Soviet soldiers had winter uniforms, felt boots, quilted jackets, and fur hats. These were not luxuries, but standard issue for Russian military. Soviets also had experience operating in extreme cold. Procedures for maintaining weapons and equipment in freezing temperatures were well established. Most importantly, Soviet soldiers had psychological advantage of knowing they were defending homeland in conditions familiar to them, while enemy was suffering in alien environment. Meretskov's offensive plan was straightforward. Soviet forces would attack from northeast and south, converging on Tikhvin in coordinated offensive. Northern Group would advance from positions near Volkhov River. Eastern Group would attack from forests east of city. Southern Group would push from positions south of Tikhvin. Objective was not merely to recapture city, but to encircle and destroy German forces defending it. Timing was set for December 10th, when reinforcements would be in position and hopefully weather would be cold enough to maximize German suffering. December 10th, 1941. Soviet offensive began at dawn with heavy artillery barrage. German defenders were caught partially by surprise. They had expected Soviet attack, but not coordinated offensive from multiple directions. Initial Soviet advances were measured in hundreds of meters against stubborn German resistance. However, Soviet pressure was relentless. Fresh troops replaced casualties immediately. German defenders had no reserves. Every soldier was already committed to holding defensive positions. German casualties could not be replaced. Evacuation of wounded was nearly impossible in weather and road conditions. Fighting in December cold was nightmare for both sides. Temperatures remained below -20 degrees. Blizzards reduced visibility to meters. Deep snow made movement exhausting. Soldiers advancing through snow became targets for defensive fire. Machine guns jammed from cold, requiring constant maintenance. Artillery pieces had to be warmed before firing. Explosions in frozen ground created less fragmentation than normal, reducing artillery effectiveness. Hand-to-hand combat occurred frequently when opposing forces met in forests where visibility was limited. These close-quarters battles were savage, desperate affairs, where exhausted frozen soldiers fought with bayonets, rifle butts, and grenades. Soviet tactics emphasized infiltration through forests to bypass German strongpoints. Small groups of infantry would advance through snow-covered woods, appearing behind German lines. These infiltrators cut communication wires, attacked supply depots, and created panic in German rear areas. German defenders found themselves under attack from all directions. Attempts to retreat were hampered by frozen vehicles, lack of fuel, and Soviet forces blocking roads. German commanders requested permission to withdraw from Tikhvin to more defensible positions, but Hitler's headquarters ordered Tikhvin held at all costs. Northern Soviet Group made fastest progress. Advancing from Volkhov River area, these forces included fresh Siberian divisions experienced in winter operations. They pushed through German defensive lines, threatening to cut road between Tikhvin and German rear. German defenders attempted counterattacks, but lacked strength and mobility. Frozen ground actually helped Soviet tanks which could move across terrain that would have been impassable mud in autumn. German anti-tank guns struggled in cold, ammunition froze, gun mechanisms jammed. Tank crews faced horrible conditions. Interior of tanks became freezing metal boxes. Crews suffered frostbite from touching metal surfaces. Starting engines required hours of preparation. Eastern Soviet group faced toughest fighting. Terrain was heavily forested, with German defenders well entrenched. Progress was slow-bloody. Soviet infantry advanced meter by meter through woods. German machine gun positions had to be eliminated individually. Soviet casualties mounted, but replacements kept arriving. Fresh troops moved forward over bodies of fallen comrades. This horrific attrition warfare continued day and night. Soldiers fought in darkness, using muzzle flashes to identify targets. Wounded who could not be evacuated froze to death within hours. Medical services on both sides were overwhelmed. Field hospitals lacked heating medicine and supplies. Surgeons performed amputations of frostbitten limbs under primitive conditions. Southern Soviet group made steady progress through more open terrain. This allowed better use of artillery and armor. Soviet tactics involved brief intense artillery preparation, followed immediately by infantry assault before defenders could recover. German defensive positions were pounded repeatedly. Bunkers collapsed from shell impacts. Communication trenches were obliterated. Defenders huddled in whatever shelter they could find, enduring bombardment, then fighting off Soviet infantry attacks. German ammunition supplies dwindled. Resupply was nearly impossible. Transport aircraft attempted to airdrop supplies, but weather often prevented flights. Drops that did occur frequently missed intended zones. Supplies fell into Soviet hands or landed in areas too dangerous to retrieve. By December 7th, after 1 week of offensive, Soviet forces were closing ring around Tikhvin from 3 directions. German garrison was nearly encircled. Road west toward German rear positions was under Soviet artillery fire. Evacuation would mean abandoning heavy equipment and wounded. German commanders finally received permission to withdraw. Order came too late. Soviet forces had already blocked main retreat routes. German forces would have to fight their way out or surrender. Night of December 8th to 9th, German garrison attempted breakout. Under cover of darkness and blizzard, German troops abandoned positions and moved west. Wounded who could walk were assisted by comrades. Those too badly injured to move were left behind with medical staff. Heavy weapons and vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. Breakout became chaotic retreat. Soviet forces harassed columns with artillery fire and small arms. German units became separated in darkness and snow. Some groups wandered lost in forests, others were captured by Soviet patrols. Main body of German force managed to escape through narrow corridor before Soviets completely closed trap. However, casualties were severe. Thousands of German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured during retreat. December 9th morning, Soviet troops entered Tikhvin, finding city largely abandoned. German rear guards fought brief delaying actions, then withdrew. Soviet soldiers encountered scenes of devastation. City had been heavily damaged by fighting. Buildings were destroyed. Civilian population that had not evacuated was starving and traumatized. However, strategic objective had been achieved. Tikhvin was back in Soviet hands. Railroad could be reopened. Leningrad's supply line was restored. Casualties from Tikhvin offensive were substantial. Soviet forces suffered approximately 40,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing. Many casualties were from frostbite and exposure rather than combat. German losses were approximately 7,000 killed and wounded, plus several thousand captured. However, German losses were proportionally more serious because Wehrmacht could not easily replace casualties, while Soviet reserves seemed inexhaustible. More devastating for Germans was loss of equipment. Hundreds of vehicles, tanks, artillery pieces, and other heavy weapons were abandoned during retreat. This equipment represented months of industrial production and could not be replaced. Strategic impact of Tikhvin recapture was enormous. Railroad connection to Leningrad was restored, allowing supplies to reach city via circuitous but functional route. Freight cars loaded with food, ammunition, and fuel could now travel to Tikhvin. Then supplies were trucked to Volkhov River, shipped across Lake Ladoga, and trucked final distance into Leningrad. Combined with Road of Life ice road across Lake Ladoga, these supply routes kept Leningrad alive through winter of 1941 to 42. Without Tikhvin recapture, Leningrad would have fallen to starvation before spring. Political impact was significant. Tikhvin offensive was first major Soviet victory west of Moscow during December 1941. While Battle of Moscow received more attention, Tikhvin demonstrated Soviet capability to conduct successful winter offensives. Stalin was pleased with Meretskov aggressive command style and successful execution. Meretskov was promoted and given command of larger formations. German high command was shocked by defeat. Tikhvin was supposed to be secondary front. Loss indicated Soviet strength was greater than estimated. More concerning was realization that Wehrmacht was vulnerable in winter conditions. Military lessons from Tikhvin influenced both sides. Soviets learned that winter offensives could succeed if properly prepared and executed. Fresh troops, adequate winter equipment, and aggressive tactics could overcome German defensive positions. This validated doctrine of winter counteroffensives that would be applied on larger scales at Moscow, Stalingrad, and other battles. Germans learned painful lesson about winter warfare. Lack of winter clothing and equipment had catastrophic consequences. Vehicles, weapons, and soldiers simply could not function in extreme cold without proper preparation. German military began crash programs to develop and distribute winter gear, but damage to morale and effectiveness had already occurred. Humanitarian dimension of Tikhvin battle cannot be overlooked. Over 1 million civilians in Leningrad depended on supply line through Tikhvin. Recapture of city meant difference between life and death for these people. While winter of 1941 to 42 was still horrific for Leningrad, with hundreds of thousands dying from starvation, disease, and cold, it would have been far worse without supplies that flowed through Tikhvin Railroad. Every freight car that reached Leningrad carried food that kept people alive one more day. Every ton of ammunition allowed defenders to continue resisting. Tikhvin offensive was not just military operation, but humanitarian mission to save city from destruction. Forgotten nature of Tikhvin battle is puzzling, given its significance. Battle occurred simultaneously with larger Battle of Moscow, which captured world attention. German forces were stopped at Moscow gates and pushed back in massive counteroffensive. This was a dramatic turning point that received extensive coverage. Tikhvin was overshadowed despite equal strategic importance. Additionally, Tikhvin was relatively small-scale battle with 100,000 participants total compared to millions at Moscow. Historical narratives focused on larger, more dramatic events, leaving Tikhvin as footnote. However, veterans of Tikhvin never forgot. Survivors remembered frozen hell of December fighting. They remembered comrades who fell in snow and could not be retrieved until spring thaw. They remembered desperation of knowing Leningrad's fate depended on their success. They remembered relief and pride when city was recaptured and railroad reopened. For these soldiers, Tikhvin was most important battle of war because it saved Leningrad and proved Germans could be beaten. Individual experiences reveal human dimension, often lost in strategic analysis. Private Ivan Sokolov was a Siberian soldier who fought in Northern Soviet group attacking toward Tikhvin. Sokolov described in post-war memoir marching through snow so deep it reached his waist. His unit advanced single file, following leader who broke trail. Everyone took turns leading because breaking trail was exhausting. German machine gun opened fire from tree line. Soldiers dove into snow seeking cover. Sokolov found himself pinned, unable to move forward or back. He lay in snow for hours as battle raged around him. Temperature was -30. He felt himself becoming numb. Comrade crawled over, pulled him up, and they rushed German position together. Hand grenade thrown into machine gun nest, silenced weapon. Sokolov survived but lost 3 toes to frostbite. He considered himself lucky. Lieutenant Hans Schmidt was German officer commanding infantry platoon, defending Tikhvin. Schmidt wrote letters home describing nightmare of defending city in winter cold. His platoon occupied positions in frozen ground. Digging was impossible in frozen earth. They piled logs and packed snow for protection. There was no heat. Fires would attract artillery. Men huddled together sharing body warmth. Sentries rotated every 30 minutes because longer exposure risked frostbite. Food was frozen solid. They melted snow for water. Weapons froze repeatedly. Schmidt ordered soldiers to keep rifles inside coats, next to bodies to prevent freezing. When Soviet attack came December 10th, Schmidt's platoon was surrounded. They fought for 2 days, then broke out during night retreat. Schmidt lost half his men. He himself suffered severe frostbite on both feet, requiring eventual amputation. Schmidt survived war and spent rest of life bitter about suffering endured at Tikhvin. Tactical innovations from Tikhvin influenced later operations. Soviet use of infiltration tactics through forests to bypass strong points became standard practice. German defensive doctrine changed to emphasize hedgehog positions that could defend in all directions, rather than linear defensive lines vulnerable to infiltration. Both sides improved winter equipment and procedures. Soviets developed better coordination between infantry armor and artillery in winter conditions. Germans learned to create mobile reserves that could counterattack breakthrough attempts rather than committing all forces to static defense. Logistics challenges at Tikhvin were immense for both sides. Soviet forces required enormous quantities of supplies to sustain offensive. Ammunition, food, fuel, and winter clothing had to be transported to front through primitive road network in blizzard conditions. Soviet logistics services performed remarkably well, considering obstacles. Trucks traveled day and night in convoys. Drivers navigated by following vehicle ahead, often unable to see road. Breakdowns were frequent. Mechanics worked in freezing conditions to repair vehicles. Supplies reached frontline units, though delays were common. German logistics collapsed completely. Supply lines were too extended. Roads were impassable. Transport aircraft could not fly in weather. German forces at Tikhvin were essentially besieged, unable to receive adequate supplies or evacuate casualties. Civilian experience in Tikhvin during battle was traumatic. Town changed hands multiple times as Germans advanced, Soviets counterattacked, and fighting surged back and forth. Civilians caught in combat zone had nowhere to go. Evacuation was impossible in winter conditions. They sheltered in basements, cellars, and ruins, hoping to survive. Food ran out quickly. Water sources froze. Many civilians died from cold, hunger, and wounds from artillery and bombs. Those who survived remembered December 1941 as month of absolute hell, when their town became battlefield and ordinary life ceased to exist. Air operations during Tikhvin were limited by weather. Blizzards, fog, and low clouds prevented flying most days. When weather permitted, Soviet aircraft conducted ground attack missions against German positions. Sturmovik ground attack aircraft strafed columns and strong points. Bombers targeted German concentrations. German Luftwaffe attempted supply missions and tactical support, but sorties were infrequent due to weather and distance from airfields. Neither side achieved air superiority. Ground forces fought largely without air support, making battle primarily infantry-artillery duel in frozen landscape. Comparison with other winter battles shows Tikhvin's unique characteristics. Battle of Moscow was larger scale, involving millions of troops across hundreds of miles. Stalingrad winter was siege and encirclement, lasting months. Tikhvin was rapid counteroffensive, focused on specific objective railroad town whose capture would save Leningrad. Duration was only 2 weeks from offensive start December 10th to recapture December 9th, though fighting continued in area for weeks afterward. Scale was moderate, approximately 100,000 Soviet troops against 30,000 Germans. However, strategic importance was disproportionate to size. Tikhvin recapture saved Leningrad, which was one of most important Soviet cities culturally, historically, and strategically. Long-term consequences extended beyond immediate military situation. Tikhvin victory boosted Soviet morale at critical time. December 1941 was moment when Soviet Union faced possible defeat. Germans had reached Moscow suburbs and besieged Leningrad. Soviet counteroffensives at Moscow and Tikhvin demonstrated that Red Army could fight back successfully. This psychological impact cannot be overestimated. Soldiers, civilians, and leadership gained confidence that war could be won. German myth of invincibility was shattered. Wehrmacht was revealed to be vulnerable, especially in winter conditions. Propaganda value was exploited by both sides. Soviet media celebrated Tikhvin liberation as great victory, demonstrating heroism of Red Army and superiority of Soviet system. Newsreels showed Soviet soldiers marching through recaptured city. Radio broadcasts described German flight and abandonment of equipment. Reality of heavy Soviet casualties and brutal conditions was minimized. German propaganda attempted to portray Tikhvin withdrawal as planned tactical adjustment to better defensive positions. However, German public was becoming aware that Eastern Front was not going as promised. Casualties were mounting. Winter suffering of German soldiers was becoming known. Confidence in quick victory was eroding. Post-war Soviet histories treated Tikhvin as important but secondary battle. Official narratives emphasized Battle of Moscow as great turning point of war. Tikhvin was mentioned as supporting operation that helped Moscow defense by tying down German forces. However, Tikhvin's role in saving Leningrad was minimized because acknowledging how close Leningrad came to falling would have conflicted with triumphalist narrative. Only decades later did fuller picture of Tikhvin's importance emerge as archives opened and veterans' accounts were published. German post-war analysis of Tikhvin focused on lessons about winter warfare and logistics. Military historians examined how forces became overextended, leading to inability to hold gains. Lack of winter preparation was criticized as major command failure. However, broader strategic questions were less discussed. German military establishment preferred to focus on tactical details rather than acknowledging fundamental error of invading Soviet Union without adequate preparation for conditions they would face. Legacy of Tikhvin lives on in memory of Leningrad survivors. Those who endured siege knew Tikhvin recapture was critical to their survival. Road of Life, ice road across Lake Ladoga, is well known and celebrated. However, supplies that came by railroad through Tikhvin were equally important. Combined supply routes kept minimum flow of food and fuel reaching city. Every survivor of Leningrad siege owed life in part to soldiers who fought frozen hell of Tikhvin, December 1941, to keep railroad open. Modern Russia recognizes Tikhvin battle significance. Monuments commemorate battle. Museum in Tikhvin preserves artifacts and documents. Annual ceremonies honor veterans, though survivors are now gone. Town itself recovered from war destruction and became peaceful place. However, landscape still bears traces. Forests around Tikhvin contain remains of defensive positions, shell craters, and unexploded ordnance. These physical remnants remind visitors that peaceful landscape was once frozen battlefield, where desperate men fought for survival and strategic objectives. Tikhvin offensive. November-December 1941 was forgotten battle of immense significance. German capture of town, November 8th, cut last railroad to besieged Leningrad, threatening city with starvation and fall. Soviet winter counter-offensive, launched December 10th in brutal -30-degree temperatures, recaptured Tikhvin. December 9th, after 2 weeks savage fighting, railroad was reopened, restoring supply line that kept Leningrad alive through winter. Soviet casualties 40,000, mostly from fighting and frostbite. German losses 7,000 plus thousands captured and vast quantities equipment abandoned. Battle demonstrated Soviet ability to conduct successful winter offensives and revealed German vulnerability to cold. Strategic impact saved Leningrad, which was vital Soviet city. Political impact boosted Soviet morale at critical moment war. Military lessons influenced doctrine, both sides remained a war. Humanitarian dimension saved over 1 million Leningrad civilians from starvation. Forgotten nature due overshadowing by simultaneous Moscow battle, but significance equals better-known battles. Veterans never forgot frozen hell and pride of victory that saved great city. Tikhvin stands as testament to determination, sacrifice and importance of logistics supply lines in warfare. Small-town railroad junction became key to survival of millions, proving that forgotten battles can have consequences equal to famous ones. Weather conditions during Tikhvin battle were among worst experienced in any World War II engagement. Meteorological records from December 1941 show sustained temperatures between -25 and -35 degrees Celsius. These temperatures were cold enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes, cause weapons to malfunction, and make basic survival a major challenge. Blizzards struck repeatedly, reducing visibility to near zero. Soldiers could not see more than few meters ahead. Navigation became nearly impossible. Units became lost, wandering in circles through forests. Soviet forces had some advantage because many troops were from Siberia or Far East and had experience operating in extreme cold. However, even experienced soldiers struggled. Frostbite casualties on both sides were staggering. Medical facilities were overwhelmed treating frozen extremities. Many soldiers lost fingers, toes, or entire hands and feet to frostbite. Some lost noses, ears, or suffered facial damage from exposure. Equipment failures multiplied in cold. German vehicles were particularly vulnerable. Engines designed for moderate European climates simply could not function at -30 degrees. Oil became thick as molasses, preventing engines from turning over. Radiator fluid froze despite antifreeze additives. Rubber components became brittle and shattered. Batteries lost capacity, unable to provide enough current to start engines. German mechanics tried every method to keep vehicles running. They lit fires under engines to warm oil. They drained oil at night, heated it over fires, then refilled engines in morning. These desperate measures rarely worked and were dangerous. Several vehicles caught fire when overheated oil ignited. Soviet vehicles had similar problems, but Soviet mechanics had more experience dealing with cold. They used thinner oil designed for Arctic conditions. They had engine covers that retained heat. Most importantly, they had access to supplies and replacement parts, while Germans did not. Personal accounts from both sides reveal depth of suffering. Sergeant Dmitry Volkov was Soviet tank commander who fought in Tikhvin offensive. He described in memoir published 1970s what it was like inside tank in extreme cold. Metal interior of tank conducted cold, making everything inside freezing. Controls were so cold that touching them with bare hands caused instant frostbite. Crew wore gloves, but gloves reduced dexterity, making operation of tank difficult. Vision through periscopes was limited because glass frosted over repeatedly. They had to constantly scrape ice from vision ports. Engine starting was major ordeal, requiring hours of preparation. Once engine was running, they kept it running continuously because restarting would be nearly impossible. This meant crews slept inside running tank exposed to carbon monoxide fumes. Volkov lost 2 crew members to carbon monoxide poisoning during offensive. Tank's gun froze repeatedly, recoil mechanism malfunctioned in cold. Ammunition had to be warmed before use, or propellant would not burn properly. Despite these obstacles, Volkov's tank participated in breakthrough of German lines and advance into Tikhvin. Corporal Friedrich Weber was German infantry soldier defending Tikhvin. Weber's letters home, intercepted by Soviet intelligence and preserved in archives, describe hellish conditions from German perspective. Weber wrote that cold was worse enemy than Soviets. His unit occupied positions dug into frozen ground on outskirts of Tikhvin. They had no heat, no warm food, and inadequate winter clothing. Men shared 2 blankets among 3 soldiers. They slept huddled together for warmth. Sentries rotated every 20 minutes because longer exposure risked death from hypothermia. Weber described watching comrade freeze to death at sentry post. Man had simply stopped moving. When relief came, they found him frozen solid, still standing in position. Weber wrote that fear of freezing was worse than fear of Soviet attack. When Soviet offensive began, Weber's unit was so weakened by cold that they could barely fight. Many weapons would not fire. Soldiers were too exhausted and frozen to move quickly. Weber survived initial assault, but was captured 2 days later during German retreat. He spent rest of war in Soviet POW camp and never forgot terror of Tikhvin, December 1941. Tactical innovations developed at Tikhvin had lasting impact on Soviet military doctrine. Merezkov's use of multiple attack axes converging on single objective became standard practice in later offensives. Rather than single thrust, Soviet forces would attack from 3 or 4 directions, simultaneously forcing defenders to split attention and reserves. This tactic worked especially well in winter, when frozen terrain allowed movement across areas that would have been impassable in other seasons. Soviet infiltration tactics also proved highly effective. Small groups of infantry would slip through German lines in forests and swamps, appearing in German rear areas. These infiltration groups disrupted communications, attacked supply convoys, and created panic. German defenders never knew if they were surrounded. Constant threat from rear reduced morale and combat effectiveness. German defensive tactics also evolved from Tikhvin experience. Linear defenses proved vulnerable to Soviet infiltration and envelopment. Germans began creating strongpoint defenses where company or battalion-sized units would occupy fortified positions capable of defending in all directions. These strongpoints were mutually supporting but not connected by continuous trenches. Theory was that even if Soviets penetrated between strongpoints, the positions could hold out until relief arrived. In practice, this system had mixed results. Strongpoints that were surrounded often had to be supplied by air, which was unreliable in winter weather. However, strongpoint system was more flexible than linear defense and gave commanders more options. Logistics lessons from Tikhvin influenced all subsequent operations. Soviet logistics planners recognized that winter offensives required massive stockpiling of supplies before operations began. Once offensives started, resupply was difficult, if not impossible. Therefore, attacking forces needed to carry enough ammunition, food, and fuel to sustain operations for extended period. Soviets also learned importance of road maintenance, even in winter. Engineers followed advancing troops, keeping roads passable for supply columns. German logistics failures at Tikhvin were studied as cautionary example. Overextended supply lines, inadequate transport, and lack of winter preparation doomed German forces to defeat regardless of tactical skill. Psychological impact of Tikhvin on German forces was profound. Wehrmacht had begun Operation Barbarossa, June 1941, with confidence of quick victory. Initial advances were spectacular. Soviet forces retreated in disorder. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured. By November, German forces were at gates of Moscow and Leningrad. Victory seemed near. Then winter arrived and everything changed. At Tikhvin, German soldiers experienced terror of being trapped in frozen wasteland, unable to move, unable to be resupplied, facing enemy who seemed immune to cold. This psychological shock undermined confidence in German military leadership and ultimate victory. Letters home became increasingly pessimistic. Soldiers questioned when war would end and whether they would survive winter. Soviet psychological response was opposite. Tikhvin victory, after months of defeats, provided desperately needed morale boost. Red Army soldiers proved to themselves and world that they could defeat Wehrmacht. Winter, which Germans feared, was Soviet ally. Soldiers took pride in ability to endure conditions that destroyed enemy. Soviet propaganda made maximum use of Tikhvin, emphasizing heroism of troops and inevitable victory of socialist system. While propaganda exaggerated and distorted reality, underlying message resonated. Soviet Union could win this war. Civilian experience in Leningrad tied directly to Tikhvin battle outcome. When Tikhvin was captured November 8th, Leningrad authorities knew supplies would run out within weeks. Emergency measures were implemented. Ration cards were cut to starvation levels. 125 grams of bread per day for civilians not engaged in essential work. This bread was adulterated with sawdust, cellulose, and other fillers. Real food content was minimal. People began dying from hunger. Deaths increased daily. Corpses lay in streets because families lacked strength to bury them, and authorities could not keep up with removals. When news arrived December 9th that Tikhvin had been recaptured, hope returned. Supply situation would improve. Not quickly and not enough to prevent suffering, but Leningrad would survive. Survivors later testified that news of Tikhvin liberation was turning point psychologically, even though physical situation remained dire for months. Railway operations between Tikhvin and Leningrad after recapture were heroic undertaking. Railroad had been damaged by fighting and sabotage. Bridges were destroyed, track was torn up in places, rails were mined. Soviet railway troops worked in freezing conditions to repair damage. They rebuilt bridges, they cleared mines, they replaced damaged rails. Within days of Tikhvin liberation, first trains began running. Locomotives struggled in cold, frozen switches had to be thawed with fires. Water for steam locomotives froze in tanks and pipes. Despite obstacles, trains kept running. Freight cars loaded with supplies moved slowly eastward. This railroad was lifeline for Leningrad, and railway workers knew it. They worked around clock in conditions that would have defeated less determined people. Medical challenges at Tikhvin tested limits of Soviet and German medical services. Wounded in extreme cold faced special dangers. Blood loss in freezing temperatures accelerated shock. Exposed wounds froze, causing tissue damage beyond initial injury. Evacuation was slow, difficult, and often impossible. Wounded who could not be evacuated quickly often died from exposure before medical treatment could be administered. Field hospitals lacked heating facilities. Surgeons operated in freezing buildings, wearing gloves and heavy coats. Amputations of frostbitten limbs were common. Anesthesia was often unavailable. Wounded suffered terribly. Infection rates were high. Antibiotics were scarce or non-existent. Many wounded died from infections that would have been treatable in better conditions. Soviet medical services managed to evacuate tens of thousands of wounded despite obstacles. German medical services collapsed during retreat from Tikhvin. Wounded were abandoned when transport was unavailable. Some wounded froze to death before they could be moved. Others were captured by Soviet forces. Partisan warfare in Tikhvin region complicated both German occupation and Soviet recapture. Local partisans had been operating in forests since German invasion. They ambushed convoys, cut communication lines, and provided intelligence to Red Army. When German forces captured Tikhvin, partisans increased activities. They attacked German supply columns moving toward Tikhvin. They sabotaged railroad facilities. They assassinated German officers and collaborators. German anti-partisan operations were brutal. Reprisals against suspected partisan supporters included executions, burnings of villages, and deportations. This cruelty strengthened partisan movement as civilians who might have remained neutral were driven to resistance. When Soviet offensive began December 10th, partisans coordinated attacks with Red Army operations. They cut German retreat routes. They attacked rear areas. They provided guides for Soviet infiltration groups. Partisan contribution to Tikhvin victory was significant, though often unrecognized in official histories. Air operations during Tikhvin were limited but important. Weather restricted flying to few days when visibility was adequate. Soviet Air Force conducted ground attack missions against German positions when possible. Sturmovik ground attack aircraft strafed German columns and strongpoints. Results were mixed. Frozen ground reduced effect of bombs and rockets. However, psychological impact was significant. German troops subjected to air attack had no effective anti-aircraft defense. Their anti-aircraft guns froze or lacked ammunition. They could only endure attacks. Soviet pilots faced dangers from weather as well as enemy. Several aircraft crashed due to icing or navigation errors in poor visibility. Luftwaffe attempted supply missions to surrounded forces at Tikhvin. Few missions succeeded. Most flights turned back due to weather. Supplies that were dropped often missed intended targets. Some fell into Soviet hands. Germans learned that air supply in winter conditions was unreliable, reinforcing lesson that would be repeated disastrously at Stalingrad year later. Comparison with simultaneous Moscow counter-offensive shows parallels and differences. Both were winter offensives exploiting German vulnerability to cold. Both achieved surprising success, pushing Germans back from threatening positions. Moscow counter-offensive was vastly larger scale, involving millions of troops, and pushing Germans back 100 to 200 kilometers along entire front west of capital. Tikhvin was smaller, localized operation focused on specific objective. However, strategic importance was comparable. Moscow was political capital, and its fall would have been catastrophic blow to Soviet morale. Leningrad was cultural capital, second city of Russia, and its fall would have been equally devastating. Both offensives demonstrated that Red Army could fight back successfully, giving hope that war could be won. Legacy of Tikhvin extends beyond immediate military significance. Battle demonstrated importance of logistics and supply lines in modern warfare. Railroad junction that might seem insignificant strategically became key to survival of major city. Tikhvin showed that small-scale battles could have strategic consequences equal to large engagements. It validated Soviet winter offensive doctrine that would be applied repeatedly remainder of war. It revealed German weaknesses that Soviet planners would exploit. Most importantly, it saved Leningrad, which was one of great cultural treasures of Russia. Art museums, libraries, universities, and industrial facilities of Leningrad survived to contribute to eventual Soviet victory. Tikhvin today is a peaceful town that bears few visible traces of terrible battle fought there. Monuments commemorate struggle. Museum preserves artifacts. Annual ceremonies honor those who fought. However, landscape itself has healed. Forests have grown over battlefields. Fields once crossed by attacking infantry are now farmland. Railroad that was fought over still operates carrying freight and passengers. Only those who know history can look at peaceful scene and imagine frozen hell it once was, when desperate men fought in -30-degree cold to capture and recapture small town that held key to great city's survival.